I think that the capacity to have practical wisdom is greatly facilitated by being somebody who has reflected on what your values are and thought about what practices can be associated with those values so that you can adapt to different contexts. So, an example of that from the book was a teacher who I was working with, who I had interviewed, was teaching in a preschool setting. And she was required in that preschool to follow a particular curriculum. And that curriculum had a set of picture books associated with it. And one of those picture books was Robert McCloskey's Make Way for Ducklings, which is a wonderful picture book. I read it to my children. I love it. I grew up in Boston. It was great. But her students didn't grow up in Boston. They grew up in a rural location where there were no streets that you would cross. There was highways you would cross. So the whole premise of the book, for anyone who doesn't know this book, is that it's a bunch of ducks looking for a home in the middle of a city, and they spend much of the book crossing a street. It doesn't make sense, and it's a long book for a preschooler to read, so it's not an easy text either. So because she knew what her core values were, she felt very clearly that at what was most important to her was not the curriculum and not the script, but that her curriculum made sense to the children in front of her. And she also knew that she really valued sensory experiences and that the children had no experiences to back up this book. So she took the children out into the parking lot at the school and they practiced crossing the parking lot. And she did something called a sound map, which is an activity where you sit in one place and you take in all the sounds. And they noted how the sounds were different in the parking lot space versus in these other spaces. That teacher was able to adapt because she knew what her values were. She was able to read her context, and then she had a lot of methods that she could apply to the situation. I will also say that I think being clear in your values helps you stay rooted when you're not sure, when you feel like you have to resist. And this teacher actually said, I was willing to get in trouble for this, and she was afraid she might get in trouble for it because I could state my why, I think was how she
Mm.
phrased it. And so her values allowed her to say, like, this is really important and made it more likely that somebody would hear her and say, okay, fine, like that's a reasonable deviation. It also, it empowers you to know when something is wrong and that it's worth taking the risk to yourself because it is truly wrong. Teaching a curriculum that makes no sense to children is wrong. And if you spend a lot of time stating that to yourself, then when you find yourself doing it, you're much more likely to push back and say, like, I'm not going to do this. Like, this is not appropriate.